They say there are abysses that, if you stare long enough into them, will stare back at you. But no one warns you about books that, when you try to read them, will read back into your mind, tearing away the folds of logic and leaving you with a cold emptiness. William Friedman knew that. At the end of his life, the greatest man in the history of American cryptography, the man who cracked the Japanese purple cipher and peered into the heart of an empire, was defeated by 240 pages of medieval vellum. He sat in his study, surrounded by dense notes, endless statistical analysis, and all he could do was write a single word over and over in the margins of the meaningless pages: bacon. It was not a discovery. It was the cry for help from a drowning mind. The thing that broke him was not a cipher. Ciphers are designed to conceal meaning. This thing was a trap, a perfect weapon in the form of a book. It arrived at Friedman's desk as a legend, a final test of his intellect. Its name was the Voynich manuscript, a 15th century relic written in an unknown language, illustrated with non-existent plants and rituals no one understood. For Friedman, it was the Mount Everest of cryptography. He charged into it with the confidence of a general heading into a final battle. He and his team used every technique in their arsenal: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, grammatical structure searches, comparisons with every known ancient and artificial language. And that's when the book starts looking back. At first, it seemed to follow a pattern. There were repeating patterns. There were words that seemed to be keywords. The structure of the text seemed logical. It lured Friedman and his team deeper, promising an imminent breakthrough. They felt they were on the verge of a great discovery, perhaps the secret writings of Roger Bacon, or a primitive human language. But every time they thought they had found the thread, it crumbled to dust. The patterns contradicted themselves. The patterns disappeared. The structure collapsed into chaotic randomness. The book did not conceal meaning. It pretended to have meaning. It was a cognitive labyrinth designed to trap and exhaust any logical mind that tried to find its way out. Friedman began to lose sleep. He dreamed of serpentine letters that crawled off the page and whispered in his ear. He looked at astronomical charts and felt they were not maps of the stars, but diagrams of an alien brain. The naked women in the blue pools were no longer an alchemical mystery. They were neurons dying in a toxic solution. The book had become a mirror, but not a mirror of reality. It mirrored the reader's own obsessions, amplifying their biases and assumptions until they could no longer distinguish signal from noise, logic from the onset of madness. It won. After nearly 20 years of intermittent struggle, William Friedman, the titan of cryptography, capitulated. But his defeat left a legacy more terrifying than an unbreakable code. It raised a question even more terrifying than the book's origins. Not who wrote it, but what wrote it. Because to create something so complex that it could fool linguists, statisticians, and later artificial intelligences, yet be utterly meaningless, required a kind of sick genius far beyond the capabilities of the average forger. That was not the work of a man. That was the work of something that wanted to study us. So, if it isn't a message, what is it? To answer that, we must follow its trail of blood and gold back to the 17th century, to a city ruled by a king steeped in the dark arts, a place where science, magic, and espionage merged. We must go to Prague, during the reign of Emperor Rudolph II. Prague, late 16th century. On the cobblestone streets, three worlds coexist in a hazy haze. The world of faith, the world of nascent science, and the world of what both have abandoned. And reigning over them all, from the top of Hradkany Hill, is Emperor Rudolph II. He is not a king of battles or treaties. He is a king of secrets. His palace is not a seat of political power, but a vast museum of curiosities, a Kunstkammer, a gallery of art and curiosities that houses everything from a griffin's claw, fake of course, to complex automatons and paintings that would make a cardinal faint. Rudolph rules an empire on the brink of religious war, but his mind is elsewhere, in the furnaces among astrological charts, and above all, in the hunt for the philosopher's stone, which can turn metal into gold and grant immortality. He was the perfect prey, and in 1586, two predators arrived in Prague. They were English. One was Dr. John Dee, one of Europe's most brilliant minds, a mathematician, astronomer, and close advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. The other was Edward Kelly, a charlatan, a mystic whose ears had been cut off for forgery, but who possessed a terrifying talent. He claimed to be able to speak to angels. Dee was the brain, Kelly the voice. They were a toxic duo, traveling the courts of Europe, seeking wealthy patrons for their great work, communicating with God in a sacred language they called Enochian. According to one of the most persistent theories, it was this pair who brought the Voynich manuscript to Prague. Picture a cold night in a private room of the Hradčany Palace, candlelight dancing over astronomical globes and strange animal skeletons. Rudolph, with the sad, weary eyes of a haunted man, sits across from the two Englishmen. Kelly, his face partly hidden in shadow, begins his story. He does not say this is an ordinary book. He says it is a relic from the pre-flood world, possibly Adam's own writings in the language of heaven. Dee, with his scholarly credentials, will nod in agreement, offering complex analyses of the book's structure, hinting that it contains secrets of medicine, alchemy, and the creation of life. They weren't selling a book. They were selling a promise. The promise of absolute knowledge. And Rudolph, a knowledge junkie, couldn't resist. He paid them 600 gold ducats. To put that in perspective, that was a fortune, the equivalent of millions of dollars today, enough to buy a large estate. No one would pay that much for an unreadable antique unless they believed it held the key to unlocking the universe itself. The theory was perfect. A genius con man, Kelly, and a fallen scholar, Dee, create an elaborate forgery to defraud the most gullible and wealthy king in Europe. The problem was there was a fatal flaw in the theory, one that modern science has discovered. Carbon-14 dating, repeated over and over again, has yielded an incontrovertible result. The calfskin used to make the book was made sometime between 1404 and 1438. Nearly 150 years before Dee and Kelly were born. This truth is more terrifying than a hoax. It defies the simplest explanation and throws us into a murky gray area. If Dee and Kelly didn't create it, then what did they find it? A ruined abbey in England? A forgotten tomb? And if they didn't understand it, how could they convince Rudolph of its value? Perhaps their trick wasn't to create the book, but to create a story for it. They may have found a mysterious object and wrapped it in a legend of angels and forbidden knowledge. They were the first to turn the book from a mystery into a curse, passing its haunting from owner to owner. The book remained with Rudolph until his death, locked away in his collection of curiosities, a mystery among thousands. But as his empire collapsed and the 30 Years' War ravaged Europe, the book began its floating journey, passing through the hands of alchemists, scholars, and priests, each adding a new layer of legend. It was no longer just a book. It became a ghost ship, and we must follow the trail of one of its passengers, a 17th century man who believed he had found the true author, and who left a hidden clue in his own letter. A clue that pointed in an entirely different direction, not to mystics, but to heretical scientists. When an empire falls, its treasures do not disappear. They simply change hands, often in secret, through furtive handshakes or whispered promises. When Emperor Rudolph II died, and his kingdom was engulfed in the flames of the 30 Years' War, his vast collection of curiosities was scattered like dust. Automata were dismantled, paintings looted, and books sold to pay debts. In the chaos, the Voynich manuscript, a priceless but useless book, began its secret journey through the 17th century. It fell into the hands of a man named Jacobus Horsecki de Tepanek, also known as Sinapius. He was Rudolph's alchemist and pharmacist, who inherited not only part of the emperor's fortune, but also his obsession. Sinapius was the first to leave a physical mark on the book. If you look closely at the first page, under a special light, you can see his signature that is almost completely faded, a ghost of his name. He owned it, studied it, and perhaps was also defeated by it because he finally let it go. The book continued to circulate among scholars and alchemists in Prague, a taboo subject whispered in letters, until it reached a man who decided the mystery was too great for him alone. His name was Johannes Marcus Marci, a physician and scientist. He knew of only one person in Europe who might have a chance of deciphering it. A great mind, one who was called the last man to know everything. A Jesuit priest in Rome named Athanasius Kircher. Kircher was a giant of the Baroque era. He was a polymath, an inventor, a geologist, and wrote encyclopedias on everything from Chinese to music. Most importantly, he claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics. His claim was completely false, but at the time, the world believed him. If anyone could crack the code of God or the devil, it was Kircher. In 1665, Marci sent the book to Rome, along with a letter that still exists. That letter is our treasure map. In it, Marci recounts the history of the book as he knows it, how Rudolph bought it for 600 ducats, and how the rumor that the author was the English polymath Roger Bacon. But then Marci reveals a contradiction, a little twist. He says that his close friend who gave him the book told him that the author, an anonymous person, had received the money directly from Rudolph. This rules out the Roger Bacon theory, who had died centuries earlier. But the most important part of the letter is its tone. It is the tone of someone unburdening themselves. Marci writes, "I believe that only you can decipher it. I entrust this mysterious object to you, my dear friend. It is not just a gift. It is a transfer. Marci is passing the torch, or perhaps the curse, to Kircher. He has freed himself from its haunting." And here the story falls into an eerie silence. Athanasius Kircher, the world's most boastful and curious man, who had written dozens of books on every subject imaginable, had been given the greatest riddle of his time. And he had remained silent. Not a single note, not a single letter, not a single essay by Kircher ever mentioned deciphering the Voynich manuscript. The book had gone into his library and disappeared. It had defeated an emperor, his alchemists, and now it had defeated the greatest mind of the century. Why did Kircher remain silent? There are two possibilities, both of which are disturbing. One, he quickly realized that this was a meaningless hoax and, in order not to embarrass his friend Marci, simply filed it away and forgot about it. The second possibility is even more chilling. He found something. He realized the meaning of the symbols, or at least the purpose of the drawings. And what he saw made him, a faithful Jesuit, decide that this knowledge was too dangerous to perpetuate. Perhaps the women in the Blue Lake are not about procreation, but about a heretical Gnostic sect that believes that the human soul is trapped in a corrupt material world and can only be liberated through esoteric knowledge, gnosis. Perhaps the book is a scripture of a faith that was destroyed by the church centuries ago. For Kircher, publishing such a thing would not be an academic discovery. It would be the spreading of heretical germs. And the best way to deal with a germ is to isolate it. The book disappeared from the Jesuit archives for more than 200 years. A long silence, a black hole in its history. It was only in 1912 that it was rediscovered by Wilfrid Voynich at a Jesuit college. But what happened during those 2 centuries of silence? And why would an institution devoted to knowledge bury a book? Perhaps the answer lies not in the book's contents, but in its drawings, not of women, but of trees. Trees that could not exist. Of all the mysteries of the Voynich manuscript, none are more fascinating and frustrating than its plants. Over 100 pages, nearly half the book, are devoted to a botany of ghosts. Each page is a detailed portrait of a plant that never existed. They are drawn with astonishing confidence. The artist clearly knew what he was painting. The problem is, we don't. This is not the ineptitude of a medieval artist. It is a deliberate oddity. Many of the plants appear to have been grafted together from unrelated parts. The roots of one plant, the trunk of another, the leaves of a third, and the flowers of a fourth. The result is a monstrous hybrid flora that defies the laws of nature. Botanists have spent their lives trying to identify them and have failed. Some glimpse a sunflower, a pepper, or an arrowroot plant. But all of these species are native to the New World, and their presence in an early 15th century European book would rewrite the history of contact between continents. Yet each time a match is found, it is wrong in some crucial detail. The flower has an extra petal. The leaf is an impossible shape. This leads to a bold hypothesis. Is this a guide to a lost world? An ecosystem endemic to an isolated island, a destroyed valley, or even pre-Columbian America? Is the book evidence of a secret journey, knowledge erased from history? But there is another possibility, closer and darker. What if these drawings are not portraits of plants, but recipes? Consider the hybrid plants again. They may not be single plants, but pictorial instructions. Take the root of plant A, combine it with the leaves of plant B, and the flowers of plant C. Suddenly, the book is no longer a botanical handbook, but an alchemical pharmacopoeia. The unnamed plants are not meant to be identified in the wild, but to be created in a lab. And the undecipherable text next to each drawing? Its detailed instructions, dosages, cooking procedures, incantations to recite, and the effects or hallucinations that the final compound will produce. This is forbidden knowledge, encoded behind a double layer of protection, an unidentifiable flora and an unreadable language. This theory opens another door, leading to one of the most profound and compelling explanations. Who in the Middle Ages held the knowledge of herbs, fertility, and healing? It was not usually monks or university-trained doctors. It was women, midwives, healers, wise women who lived on the outskirts of villages. Their knowledge was passed down orally or in secret writings, because it often ran counter to church and orthodox medicine. Herbal medicine, birth control, or abortion, all could easily be dismissed as witchcraft, evidence of consorting with the devil. Imagine such a community of women, perhaps an unorthodox monastery or a group of healers who decided to record their accumulated knowledge over generations. To protect it from prying and hostile male eyes, what did they do? They invented their own alphabet, a code that only the initiated could read. They drew plants in stylized or symbolic ways to fool outsiders. And they devoted a significant portion of their writing to recording the secrets of the female body. What we see in the pages of the women in the blue pool might be manuals on gynecology, hydrotherapy, or fertility rituals. In this view, the Voynich manuscript is not a ghostly object, but a monument to resistance. It is the suppressed voice of women, a repository of heretical knowledge, protected at all costs. That explains its secrecy, its uniqueness, and its very existence. All of these theories, from alchemy to women's medicine, rest on the same foundation, that the characters have a meaning, that they are a language waiting to be deciphered. But there is a final possibility, more terrifying than heresy or magic. The possibility that the Voynich manuscript says nothing at all. The most terrifying silence is not the silence of a hidden answer, but the silence of an empty room. For centuries, scholars, cryptographers, and the obsessed have tried to break down a door, believing that a treasure trove of knowledge lies behind it. But now a more chilling question arises. What is behind that door? This is the nothingness hypothesis, an idea once considered blasphemous by mystery hunters, but now taken seriously. The idea that the Voynich manuscript is a hoax. But if it is the greatest hoax ever created. This anonymous 15th century forger did not simply scribble nonsense characters. He created something that followed the complex statistical rules of real language. Short words appear more frequently than long words. Certain characters tend to appear at the beginning, middle, or end of words. The structure of the text follows something called Zipf's law, a mathematical rule that characterizes most human languages. In other words, its creator did not write a language, but designed a perfect fake language. He created a linguistic skeleton, an empty shell that had the exact shape and structure of a living language. This was a masterful level of deception, requiring an intuitive understanding of language structure centuries before the advent of modern linguistics. What was the purpose? Perhaps to sell it to a wealthy but naive patron, like Rudolph II, but who would spend years, at enormous expense, on parchment and paint, to perpetrate a fraud that risked being discovered. This leads us to a middle ground between code and trick, the theory of glossolalia, or trance writing. Imagine that the author is not a scholar or a con artist, but a mystic, someone who is able to enter a deep trance state. In that state, They believe they're communicating with a supernatural entity, an angel, God, or spirit. They hear a divine language, and in an effort to record it, they write down what they hear. This is not conscious language. It is a stream of the unconscious. But the human brain is a pattern-making machine. Even in its randomness, it seeks or imposes patterns. Thus, the text that is produced will have rhythm, will have repetition, will have structure, not because it follows grammar, but because it follows the psychological laws of a single brain. It will follow Zipf's law because that is how the writer's mind works. It will seem coherent, flowing, and intentional because to the writer it is completely real. This hypothesis solves almost every mystery. It explains why the text is so indecipherable. It was never a code. It explains the strange images. They are hongak, visions, drawn images from dreams. It explains the dedication and expense. For a mystic, creating such a book was an act of worship, a way to turn their sacred experiences into a permanent object. If this hypothesis is correct, then the secret of the Voynich manuscript is both tragic and profound. It does not contain the lost knowledge of humanity. It contains the unshareable inner world of a forgotten person. We are not codebreakers trying to crack a message. We are eavesdroppers listening to a prayer or an oracle in a language spoken by only one person, and that person died 600 years ago. The book is a beautiful, complex work of outsider art, and ultimately a locked room from the inside. But in the 21st century, a new collaborator joined the hunt. One that was unintuitive, unbiased, and tireless: artificial intelligence. And the machine, looking at the ghostly characters, began to see things that humans had missed. Humans look at the Voynich manuscript and see magic, heresy, or the sadness of a lonely soul. Machines look at it and see only one thing: data. And in the digital age, data is a language that machines understand better than anyone else. Unbound by history, undistracted by strange drawings, AI algorithms plowed through the book with ruthless coldness. They weren't looking for meaning, they were looking for pattern. Millions of calculations are performed in seconds. The AI analyzes the frequency of individual characters, pairs of characters, triplets. It maps relationships between words, measures the entropy, the complexity and randomness of the text. And from the abyss of numbers, it begins to pull up the ghosts of patterns. In 2018, a team of researchers in Canada ran an AI through the text, assuming it was an ancient code. The machine's results were both shocking and controversial. The AI suggested, with considerable probability, that the manuscript's underlying language was ancient Hebrew, encoded by a method of rearranging letters within a word. It even attempted to translate the first sentence of one page, which came back clumsily and cryptically. She gave advice to the priest, the man of the house, and me, and everyone. Did it make sense? Hardly, but it was something. For the first time, a ray of light, however faint, had pierced the veil. Other AIs, however, told a different story, a more disturbing one. They didn't find a hidden language. They found evidence of something else, a structural void. Further statistical analysis revealed that the text had unusually low levels of repetition and entropy compared to any human language. Words and phrases were repeated far more frequently than would be natural. Human language, even at its simplest, has a richness and variety that this text seemed to lack. This leads to a hypothesis born of the computer age. The Voynich manuscript is not the product of a human mind, whether genius, heresy, or madness. It is the product of an algorithm. Imagine a simple 15th century tool, perhaps a board with a grid of holes and holes, a sort of carding grid, or a rotating disk with letters. By following a series of simple rules, take the first letter from row 1, the third letter from row 2, the fifth letter from row 1. A person could generate hundreds of pages of text that looked complex and coherent. That text would have a pattern, a repetition, because it was produced by a simple machine. It would have fooled analysts for centuries because they were looking for a brain when they should have been looking for a set of gears. AI, with its superhuman pattern recognition, seems to confirm this. The lack of complexity, the strange repetition, all point to a mechanical process, not a cognitive one. Artificial intelligence, the pinnacle of modern logic, is telling us that the greatest mystery of cryptography may be the result of a medieval cryptographic toy. The obsession of kings, the failure of scholars, the ruined lives, all because of a mechanical trick. This is an explanation that is both elegant and cruel. It resolves the paradox of how text can be both structured and meaningless. But it leaves open a final question, one about human nature that machines cannot answer. The machine gave us a how, but it couldn't answer the biggest question of all, why? Why would someone in the 15th century spend an incredible amount of time and money to create a 240-page nonsense masterpiece using an algorithm? The scam to make money doesn't explain its scale and complexity. There must be a deeper motive. To find the answer, we have to leave the code and go back to flesh and blood. We have to find a person in early 15th century Italy who had enough brains, enough cunning, and maybe enough desperation to create a paper monster. And a name starts to emerge. An algorithm does not write itself. Behind every machine, be it gears or silicon, there is a ghost, the maker. Our search has narrowed. We are no longer looking for a sage, a mystic, or a madman. We are looking for an architect of deception, who lived in Italy in the early 15th century at the height of the Renaissance. It was an age of extraordinary innovation, of geniuses like Brunelleschi and Alberti, but also an age of fierce competition, of intrigue, and of calculating patronage by powerful families like the Visconti and Sforza. Amidst this background, one name has emerged, Antonio Averlino, better known by his nickname Filarete. He was a Florentine architect and sculptor, a creative yet conflicted mind. Filarete was a typical Renaissance man, talented, arrogant, obsessed with the greatness of antiquity, and eager to leave an immortal legacy. This is where his story intersects with the manuscript. Filarete had worked for the Duke of Milan, Francesco Sforza, but was eventually fired. He was a genius, but also a difficult man to work with, who felt undervalued, disgraced, in need of money, and most of all, needing to prove his superior intellect to a world he felt had betrayed him. Filarete had every incentive to create a masterpiece of deception, an indecipherable book filled with seemingly profound knowledge would be the ultimate act of intellectual revenge. And he had the means. Filarete wrote a famous treatise on architecture in which he described a utopian city called Sforzinda. The city was filled with strange buildings, complex machines, and hydraulic systems whose depictions were eerily reminiscent of drawings in the Voynich manuscript. The manuscript's rosette, often thought to be a map of the cosmos, looks exactly like a diagram of a star-shaped fortress, an obsession of military architects of the time, including Filarete. The intricate pipes and basins where the women bathe may not have been medical, but rather stylized versions of technical drawings of plumbing or dyeing plants for his utopian city. But what about the carbon date? The book is dated of 1404 to 1438, while Filarete was most active in the 1460s. This is the biggest gap. There is, however, a plausible explanation. The dating was done on vellum, not ink. It is entirely possible that Filarete, in order to add authenticity to his hoax, purchased an old and used notebook, a high-quality, blank codex from several decades ago. He then used the pages of this ancient paper to write and draw his hoax. This would perfectly explain the discrepancy in the dates. The picture was now complete. Filarete, a brilliant but embittered architect, needed money and fame. He took an ancient leather notebook. Using a simple cryptographic algorithm he may have invented himself, he filled it with hundreds of pages of meaningless but structured text. He drew on his architectural dreams, his impossible machines, his strange hybrid plants as a way to express his boundless creativity. The result was a perfect object, an ancient-looking book written in an arcane language, filled with images of a seemingly lost knowledge. It was not a book about science. It was the greatest portfolio ever written, designed to be sold to a gullible patron. So we have a suspect, a motive, and a method. The story seems to be closed. The Voynich manuscript is not the word of an angel or the knowledge of an alien. It is the echo of one man's arrogance, despair, and genius. But if that's true, if the Voynich manuscript is nothing more than the will of a forgotten architect, then why does it still haunt us? The book's ultimate secret may lie not in the person who wrote it, but in us, the people who can't stop reading. And so, the curtain fell. The culprit was found, the motive revealed. The 6th-century-old case seemed to have been solved. Antonio Filaret, the embittered architect of genius, had concocted the perfect hoax in his quest for fame and fortune. An explanation that was plausible, well supported by the evidence, and above all, human. But there is a strange feeling, not of satisfaction, but of disappointment. Had we, the viewers, expected something else? We wanted it to be Roger Bacon's code, filled with inventions ahead of its time. We wanted it to be the scriptures of a forgotten cult, the voice of oppressed women. We wanted it to be a message from an alien race, or a language spoken by the angels themselves. We wanted anything but a hoax, no matter how clever. Why? Because the ultimate secret of the Voynich manuscript lies not in its vellum pages. It lies within ourselves. The book is the ultimate mirror, and what it reflects is not lost knowledge, but an eternal human longing. The longing for a world larger, more mysterious, more wondrous than the one we inhabit. It is physical evidence that not everything can be explained, cataloged, digitized, and Googled. It is a wilderness of perception, a sanctuary of possibility. Deciphering it, especially with a mundane explanation like a hoax, is like finding a map to El Dorado and discovering that the city of gold is just a reflection of the sun on a salt lake. The truth may be found, but the magic is lost. And that, perhaps, is the book's greatest trick. Its true genius is not that it is impossible to decipher, but that it is so perfectly designed to resist any single solution. It has enough regularity to appeal to linguists, enough chaos to convince hoaxers, enough strange beauty to fascinate art historians, and enough spirituality to haunt mystics. It is a paper Rorschach test in which each person sees the shape of his or her own obsession. Today, the Voynich manuscript sits quietly behind bulletproof glass in Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. It has survived emperors, alchemists, wars, codebreakers, and now artificial intelligence. It has swallowed up thousands of hours of work, millions of research dollars, and bits of the souls of those who have dared to look too closely at it. And it remains silent. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question for the past 600 years. The question is not, what does this book say, but why do we need it to say anything? The answer is because we need mysteries. We need abysses to gaze into, horizons to chase. We need evidence that there is more to the universe than we can understand. The Voynich manuscript is not a message in a bottle. It is the bottle itself, a beautiful, mysterious, perfectly crafted, empty object. That emptiness is the space into which we pour our dreams, fears, and hopes. The book says nothing, and that is why it says everything. It is an eternal whisper reminding us that there are still locked rooms in this world, and perhaps some doors that should never be opened.